Thank you all for attending today, and we apologize we're starting a little late. We had an important meeting before us and trying to get a handle on some things that are going on. I'm going to give the usual statement. We welcome all of you here. This is a public hearing. We're doing the business of the United States of America, and this is just as important as a courtroom. And as a result of that, there'll be no audience participation. Audience participation includes anything that attempts to communicate with either witnesses or the committee. Whether you're standing up, whether you're talking, whether you're protesting, whether you're holding up signs, none of that is permitted here. We have zero tolerance for it. If you do that, you're going to be arrested immediately, as the people yesterday did that, were arrested. And then after you're arrested and go through the process, you will be banned from the committee for a year. And with that, we welcome your participation here as a spectator, but that's the limit of what you can do here. So with that, we have an important hearing this morning on Indo-Pacific alliances, and we have some good and important witnesses for that. I'm going to make an opening statement, and then I will recognize the ranking member to make an opening statement, and then we will hear from our witnesses, and then we will open it up to a round of questions. So with that, as an opening statement, I'd like to talk about this issue. Over the past several years, we have seen China rapidly escalate its aggressive actions against Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, Australia, and other countries in the Indo-Pacific. China has positioned itself as America's most significant long-term challenge. And that means in the short term, China's military aggression in the Indo-Pacific should not go unchecked. China's actions destabilize global security and disrupt global trade, which could impact Americans' financial aspects. And as demonstrated by China's spy balloon, which invaded our sovereign airspace in 2023, China's ambitions aren't confined to Asia. China's military is rapidly modernizing its shipbuilding capacity, which is formidable, and its development of dual-use artificial intelligence is growing more advanced by the day. In this dangerous security environment, we and our allies need to help ourselves by increasing defense spending and building joint capabilities. China's aggression should be confronted, but America should not be the world's only watchdog. To counter Chinese aggression, we need our allies to work with us to ensure each of us is strong and capable of pushing back. Today's hearing will focus on how we can build alliances that are fit and up to this task. America is well positioned because we have a commander-in-chief who understands the need for strong relationship with our Indo-Pacific allies. President Trump's recent successful summit with Japanese Prime Minister and his administration's early focus on the Philippines are proof of this. In his first term, President Trump deepened security cooperation with Taiwan, kept U.S., Japan, South Korea intelligence sharing initiative alive, and approved major arms transfers to Southeast Asian partners. We need to build on this work. Key to this is encouraging responsible and effective burden sharing from our partners. This has been a decades-long bipartisan initiative that has only become more pressing. South Korea has done great work here. Its defense spending grew consistently during the Cold War and beyond, always remaining well above 2% of its GDP. It now boasts a robust defense industry and is well positioned to work with the U.S. on boosting our shipbuilding capacity. Japan's defense spending remains comparably low, but it has taken important steps like acquiring counter-strike capabilities. And in Taiwan, double-digit defense spending increases must continue given the threat it faces across the Taiwan Strait. In addition to sharing the burden of defense, our allies need to expand U.S. basing and overflight access around the Indo-Pacific. The best way to show China that we stand together is if we are physically present in the region. The Philippines has shown itself to be a great partner in this regard since the signing of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. We need far more of this around the region. I look forward to hearing the witnesses' thoughts on how to approach both burden sharing and access. basing and overflight in Asia, and more specifically, what role the State Department should play on these issues. The issue in military aggression, the rise in military aggression from China is a threat to us all. If we do not use our alliances in the Indo-Pacific to a high standard, we do Americans and the people of the region a tremendous disservice. With that, thank you to the witnesses for being here today. We have a good panel. We're looking forward to hearing from them. With that, I'll recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Chairman Risch. Welcome to our witnesses. We so appreciate your being here this morning. From the South China Sea, where China's Coast Guard harasses Philippine forces, to Beijing's military exercises over the Taiwan Strait, there is bipartisan agreement that these aggressive actions threaten national security. But as we know, the impacts of China's rise are not isolated to Asia. Debt-trapped diplomacy with infrastructure projects in Africa, the flow of fentanyl precursor chemicals into Latin America, economic coercion in Europe over Lithuania's support for Taiwan, China's influence can be felt across the globe. That's certainly the case in Ukraine, where China and North Korea have been actively supporting Putin's war machine. Beijing is watching how we respond to Ukraine as it weighs its options in Taiwan. The presidents of both parties have recognized the challenge that China poses. President Trump took important steps by implementing export controls during his first term. President Biden not only kept those controls in place, his administration strengthened them. Our allies in Asia, as the chairman pointed out, also recognize the threat that China poses. In 2022, Japan committed to increasing its defense spending. Australia has made historic investments in AUKUS, our trilateral defense partnership with the UK, and Taiwan is boosting its defense budget to over 3% of its GDP. I agree that American allies should pay their fair share of defense spending, but we should also acknowledge that our Indo-Pacific partners are stepping up, and U.S. support for these alliances isn't charity, it's a strategic investment. America's alliances around the world are one of our greatest security assets. South Korea hosts 8 U.S. military bases and 23,000 U.S. service members. Japan not only allows the U.S. to station 55,000 troops across 15 major bases, it also helps pay for them, contributing $2 billion a year. These partnerships are mutually beneficial and go beyond our military. Whether in Europe or Latin America, our allies help us to counter China's economic influence and disinformation. The combined power of American and European markets together expands our ability to set AI standards, and our alliances support American companies and workers. Last week, I attended a defense industry roundtable on AUKUS in New Hampshire. Strengthening our submarine industrial base, like the work being done at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, does more than give us a strategic edge over China. It creates high-quality American jobs, and it supports our domestic industry. So instead of threatening or undermining friendly nations with tariffs, I think we should be strengthening our alliances. NATO has contained the Soviet Union and Russia for decades. I'd be interested in hearing from our witnesses on what mutual defense arrangements for the Indo-Pacific might look like. We need to explore every advantage that we have. Indo-PACOM, our military command in the region, has also led the way in implementing the Women, Peace, and Security Act. The commander recently told me that Indo-PACOM has been more effective than any other U.S. regional command in ensuring women play key roles in decision-making. That's a strategic strength, and we should build on it if we want to combat the growing link between security in Asia and security in Europe. As we know, the world is more connected than ever. I hope our witnesses this morning will speak not only to the challenges we face, but also to the opportunities that we can seize at this historic time. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and I'm delighted that you're joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. We'll now hear from our witnesses. We're going to start with Randall Schriver is chairman of the board at the Project 2049 Institute. He previously served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs in the first Trump administration and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific affairs. He is one of our foremost experts on U.S. alliances in Asia. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Shaheen, and other distinguished members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning to testify on this topic. So for the United States to realize our goal of a free and open Indo-Pacific, we are and will continue to be very heavily reliant on alliances and partnerships. We're a Pacific power, but we're not heavily resident in the Western Pacific. Hawaii is 3 time zones away from the continental U.S., but still east of the international date line, and even our great territories, Guam, our state of Alaska, do not put us resident enough in the Western Pacific to fully affect security the way we would like. This geographic conundrum advantages our adversaries and competitors. For China, Russia, North Korea, they enjoy geographic proximity to the areas we seek to safeguard. So this means in a contingency, whether that be Taiwan Strait, West Philippine Sea, East China Sea, the United States will always be the away team, will always be playing on the road. Strong alliances and partnerships are the best way to combat this tyranny of time and distance. In the military and security domain, we rely on our allies and partnerships for at least 3 types of contributions. First, we need them to develop their own capabilities for their sufficient self-defense, but also to be contributors to other regional contingencies if need be. Second, we rely on them for access, basing, and overflight, as has been pointed out in the opening statements, as a distant power ourselves. And third, we rely on our partners and allies to also play a role in the shaping and the support for a free and open Indo-Pacific and all that that entails, as well as day-to-day activities that uphold deterrence. So these are the things that I think are the basis for evaluating burden sharing. I think too often burden sharing is scoped down to a single figure, which is how much is a country spending per GDP, percentage of GDP on defense. I think that doesn't always tell the whole story. It's revealing, but doesn't always tell the whole story. And just a few examples. Philippines spends 1.5% of GDP on defense, but yet they're making more and more sites available for U.S. forces through, as the chairman mentioned, the ECTA agreements, 9 sites now. Japan, as was mentioned, has historically spent close to 1% of GDP, but in fact, we were advocates for actively suppressing that defense spending for many decades to now get to a point where people would like to see them do more. They are doing more, but they are also the host to the largest number of U.S. military forces forward deployed, and as Ranking Member Shaheen pointed out, they are contributors through host nation support. Taiwan is spending 2.5% of GDP, but they're also spending a lot that is not accounted for in defense when it comes to national resiliency, on energy, on communications, on civil defense. So perhaps they should be getting more credit. History is very important too. We have partners and allies that have fought alongside us in every conflict since World War I, and of course I'm speaking most directly about Australia. So I believe it's a complicated formula, and we should take a comprehensive view on burden sharing and give credit where credit is due, because these alliances are so important to us. This is further complicated by the changing nature of the threat. Chinese ballistic and cruise missiles put our forward deployed forces at risk, so we're now more and more dependent on our allies for basing and access. So spending figures do not capture the entire picture in my point of view. Our State Department will be extraordinarily important in addressing this. Our State Department, they're the lead negotiators for host nation support, for access. They run our security assistance, foreign military sales, foreign military financing, international military education and training. They run programs that are adjacent to military and security, like the INL programs that support Coast Guards through the prism of law enforcement. And I would argue even the education and cultural programs, the Fulbright, the International Visitors Program, that's investing in the alliance managers of the future, and I think that should be supported. Let me close with 4 brief recommendations that address issues under the purview of this committee. I think number 1, this committee should ask for regular updates regarding our more advanced and mature alliances, Japan and Australia, to make sure initiatives are on track with respect to posture and C2 adjustments, and both pillars of AUKUS. 2, I think the committee should insist State Department demonstrate FMS, FMF, and IMET are, in fact, in alignment with our strategic goals and should be actively shaping that. 3rd, I think the committee should insist on a speedy conclusion of U.S. assistance reviews and direct resumption of aid that aligns with our strategic priorities, things like ECTA and Coast Guard support and dioxin remediation in Vietnam. And finally, this committee should insist on a speedy conclusion of State Department review of education and cultural programs and direct a resumption of programs that align with our strategic priorities. Thank you. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schriver. That's a challenging list that you gave us, but we'll talk about that when we get to the questions. So next we have Dr. Mastro is a Center Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. She is also a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. In addition, she continues to serve in the U.S. Air Force Reserve, where she works as a strategic planner at the Pentagon. Her research focuses on the Chinese military, Asia-Pacific security issues, and coercive diplomacy. Dr. Mastro, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Chairman Risch, Ranking Member Shaheen, and esteemed members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to present my views today on how to best approach alliance burden sharing in the Indo-Pacific. I will present what types of allied support I believe will be the most strategically consequential for the U.S. ability to deter Chinese aggression and how the United States can better encourage such support. Burden sharing is often framed in financial terms, but if we take a broader perspective, the contributions that our allies can make goes much beyond defense spending. Instead, I would argue that we need to prioritize 3 other forms of contributions from our allies. First, the United States needs to focus on getting more expansive, flexible, and permanent access basing and overflight in allied countries in the Indo-Pacific. And second, the United States needs greater influence in what allies invest in to include greater support for U.S. military construction and the development of certain military capabilities that complement rather than duplicate our forces. As the previous witness already mentioned, our allies and partners are doing a lot to support U.S. defense and deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. If we do require greater access basing and overflight, in my written testimony, I lay out some specifics on what I think that could look like for our allies and partners. As I've listed elsewhere, to deter China from using force, especially over Taiwan, the United States needs to implement a denial strategy, the ability to deny China from achieving its goals through force. Some examples of things that we could do with our allies and partners in terms of ABO that could achieve this goal are things such as getting submarine tenders in Japan, more permanent basing in the Philippines, and prioritizing anti-ship capabilities in the Southwest Islands of Japan. I would also note that the United States should consider renegotiating the relocation of our Marines from Okinawa to Futenma, as that agreement was signed 30 years ago and does not take into account the rise of China and the consequential changing security environment. In addition to greater access basing and overflight, it's important that the United States works with allies and partners so that they spend on the right things, not just spend more. The United States could encourage 2 types of spending in particular. First, greater contributions to the cost of U.S. military construction. It's important to note that a lot of our allies and partners already contribute significantly to this, in particular Japan. But South Korea could contribute more to these costs. The Philippine government, however, is a bit more cash-strapped, and given that the United States is trying to gain access to basing there, this is one of the areas where the United States should be able to make greater financial contributions. Allied defense investment decisions could also be geared to better support U.S. defense industry. The chairman already mentioned the improvements in the contributions of South Korean shipbuilding, and in recent years there have been great developments in research development, licensing production between the United States and Japan, and of course a prime example being the expanded defense cooperation found in AUKUS. The United States could also encourage allies and partners to invest in capability that complement instead of duplicate U.S. capabilities. The third potential impactful area of burden sharing is mission burden sharing. The allies and partners are investing more in the capabilities to deter China and also take on a greater responsibility during crises. For example, the United States might need South Korea to be better positioned to take on responsibilities to counter North Korean hostility during potential conflicts. In this vein, South Korea should also agree to strategic flexibility for the United States, meaning that the U.S. can use our forces on the peninsula for off-peninsula contingencies, i.e. those that involve China. Japan needs to be better prepared to deter conflict in the East China Sea, and Australia, through our cooperation, could have a greater burden of exercising military dominance over key Southeast Asian choke points. Recognizing the United States can't do it all, we should also welcome coordination and cooperation among our allies and partners. Let me conclude by saying that the best way to encourage any sort of burden sharing is not to publicly criticize allies and demand it, but instead, the United States needs to offer more than security protections. Development assistance, political support, technological cooperation, economic benefits, humanitarian aid and disaster relief, these are some of the most impactful. The public nature of U.S. demands makes it hard for U.S. allies, who are all democracies, to cooperate with the United States and to consider some of the requests that we might make. In sum, for alliance burden sharing, it is very important for the United States to have access to all tools of national power in order to convince countries to be better aligned with our defense priorities. It goes without saying that that means the United States needs the full use of all aspects of national power. The recent dissolution of key agencies such as USAID or the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which oversees Voice of America, these were relatively important and inexpensive tools of U.S. power and influence, and it makes the job of projecting U.S. power overseas even much harder. And I hope, pending appropriate reviews, that the funding and support for these tools resume in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Now we'll hear from Dr. Victor Chai's Distinguished University Professor at Georgetown University, the President of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and a Senior Fellow at the George W. Bush Institute. He served on the NSC and as an advisor to the Secretary of Defense on the Defense Policy Board across different administrations. Dr. Cha is a leading expert on U.S. alliances, and particularly the U.S.-Korea alliance. Dr. Cha, we'd like to hear from you.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Risch, Ranking Member Shaheen, and members of the committee for the opportunity to speak to you today about U.S. alliances in the Indo-Pacific. I'm going to make 5 points that summarize the full statement and data that I've presented and would like to submit for the record.
It will be submitted.
Thank you, sir. My first point is historical, and that is that our alliance system in Asia, which was created over 70 years ago, have served us very well. It won the Cold War, stopped communist democracies from communist dominoes from falling, reduced poverty, created wealth, and fostered democracy. Nobody could have imagined this outcome 70 years ago. And these alliances are a unique aspect of U.S. power. The second point is with regard to shared threats. As we all know, we face these shared threats: China, the nuclear buildup, missile buildup, assertive behavior in the Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, East China Sea. This is now complicated by this axis of Russia, Iran, North Korea, and their conduits, Cuba, Iraq, Syria, Venezuela, all actively working in concert to undermine U.S. interests. As we all know, for example, in the Ukraine war, almost 100% of the microelectronics behind Russian weaponry came from China. Glide bombs, attack drones from Iran, and 50% of the munitions today that Russia uses is sourced from North Korea. So the U.S. has to prevail against these threats, but we cannot do it alone. We need our alliances. In the Indo-Pacific, the U.S. has 24 persistent bases and access to 20 other sites. By contrast, China has 1 overseas base. These bases allow for rapid response, successful defense, and deterrence, but at the same time, these alliances are in need of reform and modernization. My third point is with regard to burden sharing. And the main point here is that allies are much more capable of bearing host nation costs than they were 50 years ago. Many of the algorithms we use are legacies of the past. But at the same time, any changes should avoid surprises to give our allies in the region the domestic political space to sell new agreements to their publics, as these sorts of agreements need to be ratified by their legislatures, unlike the case in the United States. Burden-sharing algorithms that exponentially increased allied payments will not be feasible unless they take into account allied contributions outside of the alliance, on behalf of the alliance, such as the $18 billion that Japan has provided in support to Ukraine, the $3+ billion that South Korea has done as well. These burden-sharing contributions need to be documented as per legislation like the Allied Burden Sharing Report Act. My fourth point is in regard to access basing and overflight. The United States increasingly operates in a contested basing environment to include cost constraints, adversary tactics, and the vagaries of domestic political leadership in these host countries. Gaining access to allied bases and civilian facilities for prepositioning of kinetic and non-kinetic capabilities is as much political as it is a military exercise. It requires socializing publics and governments not just at the national level, but also at the local level to understand the role they play in national security. In the case of Japan, this means securing access to JSDF and civilian facilities in the dispersed positions in the Southwest Island chain. It also means the U.S. commitment to following through on the promise to create a joint force headquarters to coordinate with the newly established JJOC in Japan. In Korea, this means not just a military, but also a political discussion with the next South Korean government about the role of the Korean military and the U.S. military in a Taiwan contingency. South Korea has made good statements with regard to Taiwan's defense in the previous two leaders' summits, but now comes the hard part, bringing political consensus to think about changes that include things like force presence on the peninsula, rear area support, and South Korean capabilities to deter North Korea in the event of opportunistic aggression in a Taiwan contingency. The other point I wanted to make about ABO strategy is to complement our military access arrangements with a strategy to stop Chinese economic coercion. This is because our access could be compromised by Chinese commercial pressure on host economies with regard to our arrangements. In this regard, U.S. Indo-Pacific allies need to take a page from the EU anti-coercion instrument and build a collective economic deterrence framework that is not just an economic strategy, but is related to our military and ABO strategy. My last point is that the update of our alliances should include burden sharing in terms of allied participation in global governance institutions when our traditional institutions of global governance like the UN Security Council are underperforming. In this regard, the State Department should formalize the IP4, Indo-Pacific 4 grouping, as regular participants in global governance institutions like the NATO Leaders Summit and the G7. These allies can help carry forward like-minded agendas as the United States consolidates its power at home. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doctor. We'll now do a round of questions, and if there's interest, we'll do a second round. And I'm going to start, first of all, with you, Mr. Schriver. You talked about, and I don't mean this to sound critical, but you were questioning the use of percent of GDP as the commitment to what a country thinks it should do to defend itself. I've always had the same thought myself. My problem is I can't think of another thing that you can use to measure it. Do you have any other measuring devices that you have in mind that you think might be appropriate in that regard? We see this across government. A lot of times they'll take a broad brush and try to measure something with something that is exactly related. But your thoughts on that, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What I meant to say is it's important, but many times insufficient. And in other instances, there are factors that should be weighted more heavily, like in the case of the Philippines, 9 new ECTA sites, including those with geographic proximity to the Taiwan Strait, is extremely valuable, even though they're only spending 1.5% of GDP from a relatively small economy. So I'm afraid it comes down to more of a qualitative assessment of weighing these different baskets. What are they doing on ABO? What are they doing on their own defense? And you get really sort of qualitative when you get to history. I think it counts that Australia has fought alongside us in every war since World War I. I think that gives us confidence they'll be alongside us in the future. And to me, that is a part of having confidence in them sharing a burden in the worst of times. But that gets very hard to chart on a graph and measure.
Thank you, and I appreciate that, particularly with Australia. I mean, I never even think about what percent they spend on, it doesn't matter to me. These people are friends and have been with us through thick and thin, and that counts for way more than anything that you could talk about statistically. I'd like, I'm going to give all three of you a short run at this. Something I've been very impressed with in recent times has been the Philippines' desire to have us as an ally and vice versa. And we all know they're making real effort in that regard. What are the Chinese doing about this? Their reaction obviously is going to be negative. How does that actually materialize in reality? Why don't we start with you, Mr. Schriver, and we'll go across.
Well, they're certainly behaving aggressively toward the Philippines in the disputed territories. There's a lot of activity around Second Thomas Shoal that includes water cannons being fired from Coast Guard vessels, includes shouldering of Filipino vessels. But I think also what's going on is a lot of attempts at elite capture and economic coercion, as Dr. Cha mentioned. They're very focused on upcoming elections in the Philippines and what they might be able to do to tip the balance. So they're playing a little bit of a long game too, in addition to the points of coercion that are much more acute. So clearly they don't like it. But from our perspective, we can't have an ECTA site and have the Chinese go around and buy up everything around it in terms of the electrical grid, in terms of the communication systems, in terms of the local infrastructure. We have to be able to address it in a more comprehensive way.
Thank you. Dr. Mastro?
Thank you, Chairman. In terms of the things that the Chinese are doing, if you look at Chinese writings and speeches about the U.S. alliance system, generally speaking, I think it's very telling that they spend a lot of energy in their discourse and their behavior and their capabilities trying to undermine the U.S. alliance system. To me, the fact that they're leveraging some of these discussions right now in the United States, what the United States is doing vis-a-vis Ukraine, for example, and, for example, the dissolution of some of our key agencies like USAID, they're using those to say that, one, the United States is not a reliable ally, and two, they're also increasing their military presence around a lot of key allies and partners like Japan, the Philippines, and their aggression towards Taiwan. When I speak to the Chinese military directly and I ask them about their military activities in these areas, they tell me that they are specifically designed to demonstrate to allies and partners that the United States cannot help them. That in the case of their defense, even though the United States military is a significant force, given the fact that we are not forward deployed sufficiently, that those countries would be on their own. So there is this implicit military coercion that is occurring. And at the same time, they are offering a lot of positive inducements to some countries in the region. If we alienate certain partners in the Indo-Pacific, in particular in Southeast Asia, if we ask them to pick sides, I'm not sure we'll like what side Singapore or even the Philippines might pick in the end. And so for that reason, the Chinese are leveraging both their economic coercion as well as positive inducements. The development assistance that the Chinese are giving to Southeast Asian countries in particular is significant. And for access basing and overflight, the United States is trying to expand our relationships with countries in the second island chain, for example, Palau or the Federated States of Micronesia. These are not countries that are under direct military threat from Beijing. And so it's really some of the programs we mentioned, such as development assistance, economic assistance, military training that convince these countries to allow U.S. access. And on the same hand, the other side of the ledger, they have the Chinese coming in with elite capture and economic incentives. And so for that reason, it's very important, I think, that we focus on the military side, but also the economic and political side as well.
Appreciate that. Dr. Cha.
Just add quickly that to add to what's been said, I mean, it's not just elite capture, it's dominating sort of the information space and the media environment, media partnerships with lots of, basically resource-poor media in the Philippines. And so that needs to be combated in some way, and so things like RFA and VOA are actually quite important in that respect. And then I'll go back to the point on commercial pressure. I mean, as Randy said, there are 9 access sites. China knows how to put very directed commercial pressure, perhaps on certain localities to try to complicate our ability to gain access to those sites. So having some sort of collective strategy among Asia-Pacific partners, again, sort of like the EU has done with the ACI, is something that is important for ABO, I think, ABO strategy.
Thank you. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you. Dr. Cha, you mentioned, and I think the other two panelists also suggested this, that the new cooperation between Russia and China and North Korea on the war in Ukraine is having an impact. Can you talk about the impact that that's having to our throughout the Indo-Pacific and the concerns that that raises with our other allies in the region?
I'm happy to, Senator. So I think it has had sort of three effects. The first is it has clearly had an effect on the battlefield in the sense that 12,000 North Korean troops in Kursk to try to regain some territory before peace negotiations start. Again, 50% of Russian munitions today reportedly is sourced from North Korea. These are having real impacts on the battlefield. That's the first point. The second is that it has really created a lot of concern among Indo-Pacific partners that anything is possible in Asia now. War in the middle of Europe that looks like a war from days past caused them to think not only is war in the Taiwan Straits possible, not only is war in the Korean Peninsula possible, but these things could happen at the same time through opportunistic aggression. For the first time, we've started getting inquiries from both South Korean and Taiwan friends to think more trilaterally about those sorts of dual contingency scenarios. And then the third effect, I think, is it has really closed the gap between the way our European friends, our Indo-Pacific friends think about security. There's no longer two theaters. It really is one theater. I think in the past year made more trips to Brussels than I have to the Indo-Pacific region because of all the interest in Asia. And the level of conversation, I think my colleagues would agree, in Europe on Indo-Pacific security now is at a much, much higher level than it was even a year ago. So those would be the three things I would say.
Thank you. Do either of you want to add to that? Yes, Dr. Mastro.
Thank you, ma'am. I would add, for the China-Russia relationship in particular, there are four main things that they are complicating for the United States. But first and foremost, their relationship is making it harder for the United States to deter the two countries independently. And then I think we can see with Ukraine, and I would predict it would be the same thing in the Indo-Pacific, it makes it harder for us to compel them to stop fighting. And the reasons for that is, first, these two countries, while they might not fight together in the sort of interoperable alliance framework, they are serving and building the ability to serve as a strategic rear to one another.
So let me interrupt for a minute, because in some quarters there's a suggestion that we can actually pull Russia away from China and separate the two of them. Can you speak to that? And Dr. Cha, you may want to speak to that as well as Mr. Schriver.
I would say, generally speaking, I've done a historical review of the relationship since 1949, and the idea that you could present positive inducements or try to convince Russia, for example, that China is a greater threat than the United States or vice versa is not going to work. The best strategy, if we had any hope of pulling them apart, is that for now, while European countries are more concerned about the Indo-Pacific, it is not the case that they're reacting to China as if China is such a strong partner to Russia. They still have very strong economic relations with China, and they're reluctant to punish China for that relationship. If the Chinese thought it would come at an economic cost, their relationship with Russia, I think they would be much better geared to pull apart. So NATO could play a greater role in that that economic relationship with China to show them that they can't just get all the military benefits from Russia without some diplomatic and economic costs.
Mr. Schriver, do you have any?
I'd be highly suspicious of that endeavor, I think, particularly with Mr. Putin and Xi Jinping and the relationship that they've developed and the mutual reinforcing activities that have made them, alliance-like. I'd also point out, some people refer to this as the reverse Kissinger. Of course, when Kissinger courted China, China and Russia had already, then the Soviet Union, had already had a very significant falling out. So it wasn't creating a fissure, it was taking advantage of a fissure.
Thank you. Dr. Cha, anything to add?
I was actually going to make a similar point as Randy's. I mean, I think in international relations, that sort of diplomacy only works if you occupy the pivot position where the other two sides are coming to you. That's what was happening with Kissingerian diplomacy between the Soviet Union and China. In this case, if we were to try a reverse Kissinger, it would be Russia that occupies the pivot position. And so for that reason, I think it would be suspect. Yeah.
Thank you.
Senator Ricketts.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses here today to talk about this very important topic. You know, since signing of the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty, the Philippines has been one of our key allies in the Pacific. However, in recent years, the alliance has grown both more important and even more key as far as our strategic alignment. Despite being outmatched militarily and economically, the Philippines have demonstrated an incredible resolve in resisting Beijing's unlawful aggression in the South China Sea, certainly more recently. It is also able to act as an important voice within the ASEAN against Communist China's other pressure campaigns that you all have been talking about. But the most important is what the alliance provides us militarily. And Mr. Schriver, you were talking about the expansion of the EDCA bases and the 9 strategic sites that they've given us access to enhance our ability to deter Communist China in the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, and other key theaters. It's also allowed us to deploy the Typhoon missile system, which can hold land-based targets and China at risk, as well as surface ships. How important is it for us to continue to work with Manila to expand U.S. access to these sites and further invest in the infrastructure and housing for U.S. troops, Mr. Schriver?
Thank you. I think it's extraordinarily important, and if you kind of racked and stacked in the region, I would put the Philippines right at the top of where we need to invest, given its geography and given a window of opportunity. You know, the last administration in Manila under President Duterte wasn't exactly user-friendly, if you will. Marcos has been a sea change, and really more of a return to the norm, but a sea change nonetheless, and I think we should take advantage of that. And frankly, the population, given Chinese aggression and coercion, is also very much in support of strengthening U.S.-Philippine ties, and I think it's the time to make the investments that are needed.
Great. And, you know, we were just talking about China's really aggressive position toward the Philippines and these gray zone attacks in the South China Sea. You mentioned some of the areas there. It's really, really valuable that Manila shows this defiance, isn't it, Mr. Schriver?
It is. They're, of course, first and foremost responsible for their own defense, and I think they have done a very admirable job on these resupply missions to Second Thomas Shoal, really resisting that Chinese pressure and coercion.
So what else can we or Japan or Australia do to be able to support the Philippines as they resist this gray zone activity here in the South China Sea?
Well, I think Chinese coercion is not limited to South China Sea, so I think pushback in the East China Sea, pushback in areas closer to Vietnam. It's a comprehensive approach that is led by the U.S. but joined with allies and partners will, I think, demonstrate to the Chinese that they've got a broader problem, that the country that signed UNCLOS and ratified it but does not honor it and acts outside it is going to face broad pushback. And then on point in the Philippines, I do think we need to resume our cooperation with the Philippine Coast Guard, which is now on pause because it's a state INL program and it's a law enforcement program. The Coast Guard is really on the front lines, not necessarily the Navy in every case. So I think there's a number of things we can do, and again, it's extraordinarily important.
What about the cooperation between Japan and the Philippines? They've recently, gotten some agreements together. What do you think about that?
Very encouraging. I mean, if you looked at a map, Japan, Philippines, what's in the middle? It's Taiwan, and I think a lot of the security cooperation is oriented toward that major known contingency. But Japan is also stepping up with security assistance. So we are no longer the sole provider or only provider of military equipment and other training and other types of services. Japan is a very professional military, and they're lending that expertise to the Philippines in very helpful ways.
Yeah. I think we've provided about $500 million last year in FMS to the Philippines, and obviously it's encouraging to see Japan do that as well. And you were also talking about the percent of GDP that the Philippines is spending and valuing the bases and so forth. Is it fair for us to ask the Philippines to get to 2% of GDP spending on their own defense? I mean, they are trying to modernize here.
I'm for being aspirational, and I think given the threat they're facing, it's reasonable to ask. I think those discussions, that's why we need skilled diplomats, that's why we need capable alliance managers with years of experience. I agree there are some approaches, as Dr. Mastro pointed out, that can have negative effects, and so I think we need to do it with a degree of deftness, but it is important.
Do the Philippines have that kind of capability? I mean, can they economically support 2% of GDP, do you think?
Short answer, I would say, is yes. But it is a very robust democracy. They have a lot of other priorities when it comes to the development of the economy. So this would be grinding it out through the legislature, but I think they could get there given the threat and the very real requirements they have for defense.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Schriver.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. Dr. Cha, you've spoken extensively about the alignment of some of our core adversaries, and as you just referenced in your opening statement, support from China, Iran, North Korea is absolutely critical to Russia's war effort against Ukraine. But many, I think, are now underestimating what these three countries are getting in return for that partnership. Could you just speak briefly to what North Korea is or could be gaining from their munitions support, their now active troop support, and the negative impacts this might be having in the Indo-Pacific region, and how our allies are viewing it and how they might step up?
Sure, Senator. I mean, your question really points to the fact that what is happening in the war in Ukraine has serious impact on what's happening in Indo-Pacific security as well. Initially, I think when the Biden administration publicized the first arms transfer to the Wagner Group, we became very worried that this was the start of a relationship between these two that would only grow as Russia's need for munitions and troops also grew. Initially, we think that what was being provided was largely a lot of food and fuel and energy, things that were really stocked out in North Korea after a 3.5-year lockdown from COVID. I mean, for North Korea, this opportunity with Russia emerged just as they were coming after a 3.5-year COVID lockdown. So this was like a Christmas present for them. But the concern now is that it has moved beyond food, fuel, and energy and medicines to sort of higher-end military technology. And I think if we track U.S. government statements about this, they have moved from statements about the theoretical or hypothetical to a statement of fact. And we have seen this, I think, also in North Korea's own actions and demonstrations. Successful military satellite launches after successive failures. They became more successful after Kim Jong-un's first visit to Russia.
So it's your view that North Korea is almost certainly receiving sophisticated missile, satellite, military assistance from Russia in exchange for their support?
Yes, and the one I would in particular point to is potential nuclear-propelled submarine technology, because the North Koreans put the leader in front of a new submarine and said, this is a nuclear-powered submarine. So this is the one that I think has gotten the most attention recently. But yes, all those things that you mentioned.
I have limited time. You also spoke about the critical role that Radio Free Asia provides. It's got a $60 million budget, but reaches 60 million people a week. Given upcoming elections in the Philippines, given our concern about soft power and influence in the region, Pacific Island nations, how wise or foolish is it that the administration just canceled Radio Free Asia?
So again, I think our access basing and overflight strategy is directly related to competition in the information space, where China is creating these media partnerships all over the global south and creating a narrative of the United States that is clearly counter to our interests. So we need to be able to push back on that with real, accurate information, and that comes from places like VOA and RFA.
Dr. Mastro, you spoke to the fact that the PRC is taking advantage of our abrupt withdrawal from hundreds of different development partnerships throughout the Indo-Pacific. Just speak, if you would, briefly to what kind of challenge you think it's creating for us and our strategic interests for us to have abruptly canceled and shut down economic development partnerships, public health partnerships, things like providing reliable energy to our new basing opportunities in the Philippines, providing partnerships in terms of intel and communications security in the Philippines. What's the strategic impact to our abrupt withdrawal as partners for dozens and dozens of programs across these key countries?
So, sir, I think the first thing to mention is if we are having a hard time assessing what is impactful for the competition with China or not, it's always useful to look at what the Chinese are spending on and what they're saying. So they spend 8 times more than we do on public diplomacy. And as Dr. Chow already mentioned, with all of their information centers, with Xinhua and others, they're obviously extremely focused in this area. What's important for the Indo-Pacific is that a lot of these countries are not it's very different than NATO allies and partners in that many of these countries have a lot of incentives not to support the United States militarily. And so what we have on offer, if they're not threatened with direct invasion from China, of which even allies like Australia are not, what we have on offer are other things besides just that security cooperation. So when we build infrastructure, for example, in the Philippines, there's this understanding that with that foreign development and assistance, that type of infrastructure can be used by the Philippines when U.S. forces aren't there. And so without those types of commitments, there's a lot of countries that they put themselves at risk, that the threat from China becomes greater the more they cooperate with us. And so the only way to outbalance that is with the economic incentives, offering humanitarian aid, disaster relief, foreign development assistance. And that's why the Chinese are so focused on those tools of power.
Well, thank you. I think we're making an enormous mistake in unilaterally and abruptly shutting down long-standing humanitarian, economic development, infrastructure, and relief programs throughout the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Senator McCormick.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, thank you, and thank you to our panelists. A free and open Indo-Pacific is critical to our nation's security. I think we all agree on that. To paraphrase General MacArthur, the Pacific acts as a protective shield for all of the Americas, with the Western Pacific as its linchpin. And so I'm excited to have this great group to talk about the alliances that are so central to that shield, because they're on the front lines of defending against China, the Chinese Communist Party's aggression and escalating efforts and expansionist ambitions in the first island chain. We must stand with those allies and ensure those partnerships deliver unmatched value to both sides, including burden sharing. So, Mr. Chow, or Dr. Chow, good to see you again, and I'd like to start with you. Japan has been one of the allies where we've seen the most progress in increasing defense investment and interoperability with U.S. forces. We recently had Ambassador-designate Glass testify before this committee. What priorities should be top of mind for him and for this administration to make that deterrence from the U.S.-Japan alliance most credible?
Thank you, Senator. So I would say that there are 3 things. The first is, as I mentioned in my testimony, the Japanese stood up the JJOC, right, the Japan Joint Operational Command. It was a big step in the alliance to try to create a much more militarily capable, interoperable, integrated relationship with the United States. And so it's incumbent on our side to really fulfill our commitment to create a joint force headquarters. So I think that's one, even though that's not necessarily a diplomatic thing, it's an important message to send. The second is what I would like to see is a continuation of the bilateral and the trilateral relationship among the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. This was something that both the first Trump administration as well as the Biden administration worked on. Major steps were made since August of 2023. I know we have a little bit of a political situation in South Korea waiting for a new government to come into place. But in terms of defense and deterrence and making more credible the U.S. position in Asia and giving confidence to allies in the Indo-Pacific as well as in Europe about U.S. sustained commitment, I think that's extremely important as well. And then the third are the things that my colleagues have mentioned in terms of Japan's role in places like the Philippines and in other parts of Asia, where they can, in Taiwan, where they can play a very important role in helping to complement what the United States is doing in terms of access basing and overflight.
Very good, thank you. Mr. Schriver, Secretary Rubio recently reiterated U.S. policy with regard to Taiwan. Any forced, compelled, coercive change in the status of Taiwan. Where would you see the United States falling short in its role in deterring a war in the Taiwan Strait?
Thank you, Senator. So I think I would point to a few things, and it's not necessarily falling short, but there's been an evolutionary process where we've been more direct in our language and rhetoric. We've been moving into areas that were previously too sensitive, like training of Taiwanese military forces. So I think we need to continue the posture initiatives. We really need to develop the Philippines, particularly northern Luzon, which has that geographic proximity to the Taiwan Strait. We need to strengthen our training of Taiwan military forces. That was a taboo for decades, and now we're getting them to a point where they're more professional, more proficient, as they're placing a greater emphasis on training. And I think, as Dr. Mastro implied in her opening statement, it's not only what they spend. They've got to 2.5. They pledged to get to 3%, and they say that's a floor, not a ceiling. But it's what they spend it in and what they invest on. And I think given the changing nature of warfare, they need to look at modernized command and control that will help optimize battlefield decisions. They need to look at a lot more unmanned autonomous in every domain, including underwater. So I think we need to help lead them in this investment strategy as really key to upholding deterrence.
Very good. Thank you. I'll yield the rest of my time.
Thank you. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. My office has been hearing about how vital initiatives aimed at advancing American interests in the Indo-Pacific have been stalled over the last several weeks, and this is following up on my colleagues' interest in the Indo-Pacific as well. This includes not only critical programs, but also essential funding that supports intelligence efforts on pressing regional issues. I'm deeply concerned that the current administration is pursuing a path that directly contradicts strengthening Indo-Pacific alliances, a move that could have far-reaching implications for our security. Like my colleagues have mentioned, I am deeply concerned about the PRC's activities in the region. Before this administration, the United States led with a clear strategy: invest, align, compete. In response to this PRC's growing geopolitical influence in the Indo-Pacific. And we demonstrated that strength by consistently following through on our commitments, proving to our allies that the U.S. is a reliable partner, a leader in defending democracy, and a defender of international norms. This strategy was central to our global leadership in maintaining peace and stability in the region. And unfortunately, we are walking backwards, as the Trump Asia policy of today seems to be neglecting our well-established alliances, institutions, the rule of law, and rules. And I am a co-founder of the Bipartisan Quad Caucus, and I made it a priority to send a clear and powerful message to our allies, partners, and even competitors that the United States is committed to the Indo-Pacific region in the long term. And I wholeheartedly believe that defense diplomacy and cooperation are crucial. Mr. Schriver, as someone who has held a key in shaping U.S. defense policy in the Indo-Pacific, what specific steps should the United States take to demonstrate its long-term commitment to the Indo-Pacific and its allies within the context of the Quad?
Thank you, Senator Duckworth, and thank you for your leadership on the Quad. It's very important. So I'm the only one up here who's not a professor, but if I were to give this administration a grade, it wouldn't be failing, it would be incomplete, because I think they've done some very positive things. The Prime Minister Shiba visit, Prime Minister Modi's meeting with President Trump, and I would point to Secretary Rubio's decision on the very first day in office to hold a Quad meeting as part of that positive agenda, notwithstanding some of the other issues that you mentioned, and I share some of your concerns, I'm sure. I think that what we understand took place in that Quad meeting at the foreign minister level is there was a very kind of nascent discussion about moving into the security issues. And that's significant that Foreign Minister Jaishankar would go along with that and actually introduce some of that, as I understand it, which indicates India is sufficiently concerned that they're willing to take this format and move it into military and security issues. So I would like to see that nurtured and matured and even perhaps go operational. We've got a lot of PLA activity in the Indian Ocean now. Anti-submarine warfare cooperation could happen quietly, but it could involve the four countries doing real-world things that would be very significant.
Don't you think that that is also a place where we can strengthen our relationship with Quad, but also not alienate important regional partners like ASEAN? And I do think that there is a need to strengthen economic relations with the Quad, but in a way that complements our relationship with ASEAN and their leadership role. Both, so I'm asking both economic cooperation, but also cooperation, especially when it comes to strategies where the Chinese are really infiltrating into the region. So go ahead.
Thank you. I do agree with that. I think you're the expert on ASEAN, but it's a region of very mixed stages of development, different types of government. And so I think disaggregating and looking at where the Quad can be helpful as a donor, as an economic partner, I think that kind of sophisticated approach would really help counter what China is doing. And China is gaining ground in Southeast Asia. There's no doubt about it. And we're seeing a lot of it, particularly since the tariffs, we're seeing a lot of Chinese investment going into Southeast Asia, some of which is helpful to them, but some of which is also overcapacity, crowding out some of their indigenous manufacturing and aspects of their economy. So I would like to see the Quad do more in this area.
Yeah, because I think Quad investment into ASEAN, maybe as part of the supply chain manufacturing issues for the United States, is an opportunity. And frankly, we've come off a very strong year in ASEAN of Indonesian leadership. The Malaysians are doing a great job there now. Philippines are next. I think there's some real opportunities there for some partnerships, and I would like to see the United States continue to pursue those economic relationships in addition to the strategic partnerships, but making those linkages between Quad and ASEAN. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth. Senator Cornyn.
Thank you all for being here. Mr. Schriver, I like your characterization of the tyranny of time and distance when it comes to the Taiwan contingency. We like to talk about very euphemistic terms, which could be a bloody and very destructive military conflict. First, let me ask you about supply chains. The reason why Senator Warner and I and many of our colleagues joined together and passed the CHIPS and Science Act, starting back in 2020, but then finally, I guess, in 2022, was because we were worried about the supply chains of advanced semiconductors and the fact that the United States only made about 12% of those, and the fact that in this world we live in, we are extraordinarily dependent on that sort of technology for everything from our iPhones to the avionics and the Joint Strike Fighter. Are there other supply chains that we need to be concerned about in the event of another pandemic, natural disaster, or a military conflict in the Indo-Pacific? And I would invite anybody to offer any advice now, and if you want to get back to us with a more comprehensive list, I would welcome that.
Thank you, Senator. I think when you look at something like chips, you got to understand the component parts, which gets down to critical minerals and the mining and the processing, and so it's a very complex supply chain. And where I think we can do better now to better position us for resiliency in the event of a conflict is to really look at alternate sources of critical minerals and that processing and that whole sort of chain of production. Right now, we are heavily relying on China.
Yeah, China processes 90%.
Yeah.
90%, as I recall. Any other thoughts on supply chains from the other panelists?
I just want to add that there's no entity that is in a better position to protect U.S. interests than the United States itself. And when we pull out of the Indo-Pacific, we are basically outsourcing that to another country like China. And China itself has a Made in China 2025, Standards 2035. They've identified 15 areas where not only do they want to be self-sufficient so that we have less power to shape their decisions, but they've been very explicit that they want the world to be reliant on them precisely so they have this type of leverage that you are talking about. In any scenario involving Taiwan, the Chinese are hoping this is going to be a quick war, 3 to 4 weeks. And even in those types of scenarios, the disruption economically is going to be significant. But the United States needs to be in the position that we could intervene in that time frame so that what we threaten is much more of a global disruption to the Chinese themselves.
Well, because time is so short, let me start with Dr. Cha on this question. You talk about how long the Taiwan contingency conflict will last. My impression from traveling in the region is that we have a lot of wonderful allies that have capabilities, and they vary a lot depending on the nation. And but we've seen in Ukraine there's a difference between capability and will. And one of the things that I am very concerned about is we are overestimating what our allies might be willing to do. I think, Dr. Castro, you mentioned they're reluctant to take sides. That seemed to be the typical response we got as we were talking to folks in the Indo-Pacific. But in terms of, and I know this is a hard question and maybe one we don't want to confront, but I don't think we have any choice but to confront. If there was a shooting war in the South China Sea where, according to President Xi's instructions to the PLA, they needed to be ready by 2027 to essentially take Taiwan, who can we depend on? What countries? And if you could list those in terms of our, who would be the most likely and who would be the most effective, that would be very useful.
Well, sir, if I can just say, we can depend on Japan to allow us access to U.S. bases at the very least. Japanese logistical support will be critical, but that will only come into play in a more protracted conflict if the United States does intervene in time. The northern Philippines and southwest Japan are the only areas in combat radius of Taiwan. And so the immediate support of use of U.S. bases, and in the Philippines in particular, we're not investing right now in the types of air and naval capabilities that we need to be able to respond in a timely manner in the Taiwan Strait. But if we did that, it would basically be the almost immediate permission to use those bases in the northern Philippines and southwest Japan for direct kinetic action against the ships making their way across the strait. That would be by far the most critical. And then in a more protracted conflict, other basing options like in Australia and in the second island chain become more important. But immediate approval from Japan to use those bases, like within hours, is the most important thing.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. The only thing I would add is the point about the duration of the conflict and the scope of it. If the duration of the conflict and the scope extends beyond the first island chain, second island chain, even Indian Ocean, then that necessarily will bring other players in. And if it gets to that level, I think we would be able to count on some of those players, even potentially the Europeans, to help as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Rosen, you're next.
Well, thank you, Chair Risch, Ranking Member Shaheen. Thank you for being here today, for holding this hearing. Now, I want to talk about countering the PRC influence, of course, in the South Pacific. It's what we're talking about today, because our economic security, our security relationships with the Pacific Island nations play a significant role in our ability to counter expanding PRC influence. It's particularly true for members of the Compacts of Free Association, or COFA, an agreement that serves as a bedrock of U.S. engagement with Palau, the Marshall Islands, and Micronesia. COFA is a mutually beneficial arrangement affording our military access to areas of immense strategic importance in exchange for U.S. assistance. Under COFA, U.S. aid is tasked with leading disaster response efforts to all 3 island countries. But with USAID gutted, no other agency has the authority, the technical expertise, the capacity, or the resources to respond to a natural disaster in the Pacific. Disregarding our obligations under COFA potentially puts us in violation of our own agreement and will only cede ground to the PRC, which has been actively using, as we know, humanitarian assistance to expand its sphere of influence in the Pacific. So, Dr. Cha, can you speak to the importance of the COFA agreement and USAID's presence in the region to U.S. national security? And can you expand on some of the consequences if the PRC were to displace us in the region?
Thank you, Senator. I mean, I don't disagree with the way you've characterized the importance of the Pacific Island nations and also the vacuum that could be filled by China, or is already being filled by China, when U.S. assistance is not there, U.S. commercial support, all of these things. I think the Biden administration deserves credit for responding to this, but I mean, at the same time, unfortunately, it was too little too late because the Chinese had already made security agreements of that nature. You know, again, I'll go back to one of the points that I talked about in my testimony, which is in addition to the importance of things like RFA and VOA to compete in the information space so that there is a fair narrative of the United States and our interest in the region. The commercial support is also important. Again, China has used economic coercion against 18 governments and over 500 companies since 2008, heightened during Xi Jinping, of course. And these Pacific Island nations, they're just easy prey for North Korea, for Chinese influence that way. So we need to be able to combat that as well.
Well, I want to expand a little bit upon that because it's also one of the it's also one of the only 3 Pacific Island nations to recognize recognize Taiwan's independence. And so it's something I discussed with Palau's president when he and I met back in 2021. And so as a result, Palau is increasingly becoming a victim of PRC harassment. So to increase Palau's resiliency, USAID was supporting the development of an undersea cable system, which is vital for global communications, facilitating financial transactions for national security. This program is now halted as a part of the overall foreign assistance freeze. So I'm going to stick with you, Dr. Chautin. You talk about the importance of infrastructure development, undersea cable systems in the Pacific Islands. And what signal do you think we're sending if we're stopping this support to Palau and to others?
Well, I mean, as we often say in government, you can't fight something with nothing. And so if we are moving away from, we can of course look to allies and partners like Australia and others to help, but if the United States is not supporting that, then it's just going to be it's a vacuum that's going to be filled by China or other actors that seek to undermine our interests there.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit, Dr. Mastro, quickly about economic coercion by the PRC. We know that they're really spending a lot of money by supporting Philippines on energy security, infrastructure spending, pre-positioning near key military installations, economic development programs. I'm going fast because my time's running out. Humanitarian assistance to demonstrate the value of what they're doing. Much of the work we've been doing is stopped. They're stepping in. So, Dr. Mastro, can you expand on some of the more prominent coercive tactics the PRC employs in the Indo-Pacific region?
To the discussion, ma'am, that we were just having, it is they have a 3-pronged strategy, and one key part is exploitation or exploiting gaps where the United States is not present. They have more consulates and embassies in the region than we do. They have more elite visits than we do, and obviously we've talked about the foreign aid and development assistance. So part of it, of course, is these positive inducements. When it comes to the coercion, the Chinese, when they have leverage, they use it every single time. And so we can't expect that if we step away, so we're no longer in a position to ensure freedom of navigation. So countries like the Philippines will have to trust that the Chinese will allow them to trade with the rest of the world. And while some might say, oh, the Chinese would never cut off that access, I think it's been pretty clear that when they're upset about something, and we're not even talking about foreign policy, military strategy, if you say or believe anything different about what happens domestically in China, then you are a target. Our allies and partners, I think, have learned and are learning more and more. If your strategy is to not upset Beijing, if that is your defense strategy, it's not going to work.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you, Senator. Senator Scott.
All right. Thank you, Chairman Risch, Ranking Member Shaheen. Thank you for your testimony today. So first off, do you think that as China builds up their economy, there's a greater chance that they're going to use their military to invade Taiwan?
Well, sir, I would focus on their military capabilities. We are not deterring China right now from taking Taiwan by force. What is deterring them is they haven't finalized their military modernization. In particular, they haven't honed command and control and logistics.
So if they have a crappy economy, if their economy falls apart, will they have less military assets?
So far, sir, the size of their economy, they don't have to choose between guns and butter. And so it would really have to be such a decrease that you have widespread social instability. In that case, I think they turn inward. But otherwise, I think they have the resources to continue the modernization.
So what percentage of their economy is tied to the American consumer?
So I'd have to get back to you on the specifics, but they are an export-driven economy, and their connection to the global economy is number one. If they believed trade with U.S. allies and partners would stop if they attacked Taiwan, they would never do it.
So do you think it would be logical for any democracy, including the United States, for the people in these countries to stop buying Chinese products?
Well, sir,
Not whether it be easy, should we?
so the way I think about it is if in times of peace, before we have this type of conflict, if we get rid of all of our leverage against the PRC, we don't have that economic deterrent in place. The Chinese are trying to diversify and to be less reliant on us for a reason. So I think those measures should be considered and should be in place in times of crisis, but potentially not something implemented in peacetime.
So they're using they're using their economy right now to build up their military. So wouldn't we be better off to stop buying anything from them today, so they'll have less resources to modernize their military? I mean, after the fact, it's too late. Once they have the military that they have it. Like, I personally do not understand why anybody buys an American Chinese product. I mean, I've never understood it. When I came up here 6 years ago, 85% of the drones bought by the federal government were Chinese made. That seems like stupidity. It only took 6 years to get that passed through the NDA. I don't know why we want to continue to build the Chinese economy. So do you guys intentionally go buy Chinese products?
So I would add that the technology, I think something that you highlighted is vitally important. If there's any U.S. product, technology, know-how that contributes to the lethality of the Chinese military, those absolutely need to be prevented from being exported.
So you don't think it matters what their economy is doing? I mean, they didn't seem to have a very good economy back when our big military, when their economy was one-tenth the size. And they clearly couldn't threaten Taiwan when their economy was one-tenth the size. So I don't get why we help them build up their economy. Does anybody else care?
I think it's an extremely valid point. I think for many years, we thought that our economic engagement would help shape and change China politically. It didn't. I think there are constituencies in the United States that do profit from the trade relationship with China, and they continue to be advocates for it. I think we should look at things like revoking PNTR. I think we should look at strengthening export controls and outbound investment. Makes no sense to me that we would restrict the Chinese from investing in an entity in the United States that is engaged in developing some technology with military applications, but yet outbound investment can go invest in a Chinese entity that does the exact same research. Makes no sense at all.
Dr. Cha, what do you think?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is that, the other effect of the world's economic interaction with China is that it has caused many countries and allies of ours to self-censor. They stay away from saying things or taking actions that are in favor of the United States because they're worried they're going to get whacked by China with some sort of trade sanction, and all of a sudden they're going to stop sending tourists, or they're going to stop, importing bananas from the Philippines. I mean, there's a whole list of things that China does, basically weaponizing trade and interdependence.
Yeah. Well, I know my time's up. I don't get why we buy one product. I mean, our military is dependent on Chinese drugs. I mean, how are you going to change on a dime once they decide to invade Taiwan? Why we would ever rely on Chinese technology for anything like drones? This seems pretty foolish. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you. I have a few more questions before we close the panel out. First, I'd like to go back, Mr. Schriver, I think, to Senator Ricketts' question about the foreign military sales in the Philippines, and I would just like to point out for the record that $164 million of the $500 million in FMF for the Philippines is frozen under the cuts and the freezing of programs with the State Department. So that's troubling when we think about what we're hoping from the Philippines. But I wanted to, staying on the Philippines, the ICC has arrested former President Duterte on a warrant for extrajudicial killings. Do you all have any view on how that's going to affect the upcoming presidential election in the Philippines and what that might mean for the U.S. relationship with the Philippines? Anybody have any thoughts about that?
It's an excellent question, and it's probably too soon to tell. I think there's a segment of the population that doesn't like to see a former president carted off in handcuffs. notwithstanding the actual things he authorized as president. And of course, this is a family affair. His daughter is the vice president and presumably leader of the Duterte faction in the next set of elections.
So maybe I should ask
Yeah.
it this way. How do we think, if she wins the next presidential election, how do we think that will affect the relationship with the U.S.?
We've got about as good a partner as we could ever want in Marcos, so inevitably it probably goes down. She is in many ways her father's daughter and thinks similarly about some of these issues like the alliance. But she's also shown streaks of independence, and of course she has a complicated relationship with her father in other ways. So I think it's difficult to say, but I think we have a window of opportunity now, given Marcos, which is why, as you point out, the things that are frozen, I think we should be moving with all due urgency while this window is open.
Do you all agree with that assessment?
Yes, ma'am, and if you would indulge me, given your question, I think it highlights the importance of having a really nuanced understanding of the domestic politics in the Philippines. We've already mentioned the seizure of the dissolution of some programs under this current administration, but also besides the Fulbright's research funding under Minerva grants, for example, have all been ceased. And as a professor at a university, having people study these types of issues. We don't have PhD students anymore that we are encouraging to learn languages, to do these sorts of things because the funding has stopped.
I agree. I think it's totally short-sighted and doesn't recognize how important soft power is to deterring a conflict and aggression. Dr. Cha, did you want to add anything?
I agree with that. I mean, it's not just a military alliance, it's a relationship, right? It's a political, it's a social relationship that crosses generations. And so in all of these countries, all of these Indo-Pacific allies, as I mentioned in my testimony, it's about political engagement, not just military engagement. And in the case of the vice president, it's a very important role for the State Department and others in terms of diplomacy is early engagement and socializing not just the elite, but also the public about why these 9 ECTA sites are important.
I want to go back to the information space because you've mentioned, several of you have mentioned RFA and VOA, and we had a hearing here on China. I think it was our first hearing, and one of the people testifying pointed out that China spends over $1 billion that we know of a year in the information space, trying to influence information in countries in the Indo-Pacific, and much of it is disinformation and misinformation. So can you talk about what that means for us when we're not playing in this space at all?
Sure, Senator. So recently I was asked, this was before the cuts, asked to speak to a group of Fulbright scholars who were going out to countries in Southeast Asia and Central Asia, places where there's a lot of Chinese media partnerships. And I told them that they should expect to go into an information environment in which everybody believes that the war in Ukraine was started by NATO. And they couldn't, they were Americans, they could not believe that people would think that. But this is what happens when you try to fight something with nothing. And so I think Oriana said it great when she said they spend 8 times more on public diplomacy than we do. That about tells you who's dominating the information space. And again, that directly relates to the military. That is not sort of 2 or 3 steps removed from the military. That directly relates to political consensus on access, basing, and overflight.
Yeah, anybody else want to add? Go ahead.
Ma'am, if I can just add, Xi Jinping himself has been very clear that his top priority is to be the leader of the developing world. Before this administration came in, when I was providing recommendations and advice, I would say the United States hasn't really had a strategy towards the developing world in a long time, and that should be our #1 priority, is enhancing and increasing spending in some of these areas. We look at some of this propaganda coming out of the CCP and we think it's so heavy-handed, who can possibly believe this? But after you spend time in a lot of these places and spend time in Beijing, I've been there for some of their top meetings of defense ministers with developing countries. And the rhetoric about, the imperial United States, the colonial United States, I often have to remind everyone that the United States has never been a colonial power. It really resonates with a lot of these countries. And these are places, in some cases, no U.S. president has ever visited. Xi Jinping has gone to 70% of the poorest countries in places like Africa. Central Asia, where our leaders just don't go. And so, it used to be the case that the Foreign Service could fit on one aircraft carrier. I wonder what it's going to look like in future years. But expanding our reach through those types of programs and departments is not only effective, as the other witnesses have highlighted, but it's actually, relatively cheaper than trying to do it through military means.
And I'm out of time, and we have to go vote, but I just have a final question, because I visited the Indo-Pacific last year, and one of the countries we visited was Vietnam. And I was amazed at how positive all the leaders we met with in Vietnam were about their strategic partnership with the United States, how they wanted to expand on that, the plans they had to grow the economy, and their willingness to stand up to China in ways that many of the other countries in the region were not. Does anybody want to speak to what opportunity we have with Vietnam? Mr. Schriver.
Thank you, Senator. We poll as a country, not political leaders or parties, but as a country, 94% favorable in Vietnam, which is just stunning given how
Very
recent
stunning.
our conflict was.
Yes.
Now, the Chinese poll in single digits, and those two figures might be related, but that to me suggests there are definitely opportunities. When I was at the Pentagon, we did try to open things up. We had 3 aircraft carrier visits to Vietnam in about 3.5 years. And so there are ways that we're expanding the relationship. We're helping them with the maritime domain awareness issues related to the Chinese incursions. But here's where I'll come back one more time to things that we have suspended. The dioxin remediation is absolutely critical. The legacy of war issues are absolutely critical enablers to the broader military and defense cooperation that we want. I've been to those sites, been to Bien Hoa. I've seen the local population, how much they appreciate it, because they've been concerned at the effects of Agent Orange. If we step away from that, these opportunities will close.
I couldn't agree more, and thank you all very much for your testimony today.
Well, thank you. Been a very interesting panel, and we really appreciate all of your views on these matters, critically important to people of the United States. I'm going to keep the record open for questions till tomorrow at the close of business, and I would ask if you get a question, if you would respond promptly. I know you're volunteering to this, but nonetheless, if you would help us in that regard, we really appreciate that. And again, thank you for your testimony. The hearing's adjourned.